You're listening to Members of the Jury, the show that takes you straight into the trenches of justice, where the passion, players, and consequences are real. Each episode, we examine current events happening in the system. From the battles in courtrooms to the streets demanding reform, we bring those stories here to you, the members of the jury, because we aren't afraid to take it to the box.
What's up, members of the jury? Happy Freedom Friday. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm very excited to have this conversation today because I really think it can have such a huge impact on criminal justice reform across our country going forward. Any given day, there are hundreds and thousands of individuals sitting in a county jail across the nation. In fact, most of them are being detained pre-trial without having a conviction of any kind. Incarceration and overcriminalization have become proposed solutions to issues such as homelessness, mental and behavioral health issues, and those suffering from substance abuse and addiction. It should not be surprising to see that those who are most impacted by the overcriminalization and incarceration model are individuals who are in the minority classes, such as those who are poor, people of color, in the LGBTQ plus community, and those suffering from addictions and mental health issues. However, there are alternative solutions to incarcerations that can be implemented that would allow for an individual to still serve out a time that they have been sentenced to while still being put in a position to allow for them to have better access to rehabilitation, to allow them to continue to go or even seek out things like work and treatment opportunities. To help us become more aware of the types of alternatives to custody are out there and how they can have a better impact is Deputy Public Defender Grant. Grant, please introduce yourself to the members of the jury.
Hi, everyone. My name is Grant. I am a public defender, and I've been a public defender now for almost 6 years, and I love my job a lot. So it's a great job.
Well, Grant, we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today and help us take this matter to the box. Real quickly, a little bit more of a background. What led you to your journey to become a public defender?
Yeah, so my journey to being a public defender or attorney alone was very different. In undergrad, I was not pre-law. I actually majored in the biological sciences. So that was my undergrad degree. And for a couple of years, I actually worked as a lab technician in a diagnostic lab. And so, but I definitely wanted a work or a job that was going to be fulfilling and specifically to help people, especially people who are disenfranchised or a lot of times forgotten. And so I looked to see what kind of jobs that would be. I was looking at like teaching, like social work, counseling. And then I was turned over to law because a lot of times that's where you can make a big difference, especially, policy changes, law changes. And so I applied to law school with that idea. But even at that point, I did not specifically think criminal, let alone criminal defense. But I kind of started as a crossing off my list to experience. And so I chose criminal defense as like my first internship at the public defender's office. And I just fell in love with it. The culture in the office was great. And mainly the culture of the people in there who were fighting for people's rights to ensure that they are protecting the rights of the clients, and just very passionate about helping people who are most of our society will not even recognize or think about. And so seeing that type of passion and just dedication was extremely enticing to me. Definitely the work is quite hard, but I think the reward for what we do is just completely makes it all worth it in the end. So that's how I got into public defender's office that I work at. And it's great.
Well, I definitely share a lot of those same sentiments and obviously do similar work. I think it will be really helpful before we really get into the nitty gritty of this episode to help just give a certain foundation with certain aspects. We'll be using terms like custodial, in custody, incarceration, pretrial detainment. Can you give us just a simple breakdown of what it means for someone to be physically incarcerated, the traditional form, and what type of limitations they face while under that category?
Yeah. So what happens is most of the time, depending on the person, when they are arrested for a crime, they become incarcerated, and specifically that means is that they are taken into jail. There's several jails in the city that I work at. You'll get processed, and the horrible, which, not to deviate too much from the topic at hand, but then ultimately you get booked in on certain charges, and then based on those charges, there's a certain value that is associated to each charge that you're booked in, and that's what a lot of people think of when they're in bail, when the bail is set. And so when you're incarcerated, it's not like, especially American jail system and prison system, it's not great at all. You're very much, especially during the pandemic, we saw even the environment be even worse, but you're limited on your phone calls, limited on your ability to exercise, dietary issues, things like that as well. And then obviously, if you come from a background, lower socioeconomic, people of color, other disenfranchised groups, a lot of times you're not able to meet that bail. And so you could have had a job or work the next day, but because of the way the bail is set and being that it's astronomically high, you're going to miss your job. And, if you're even there a couple of days, we know a lot of times people lose their job. You're away from your children. It's just completely shut off from the rest of the world. And so and what's crazy is you're just arrested for a crime. You're not even found guilty. There's not even, even on a lower standard, it's just some law enforcement believing that you've been arrested for something. And it could take several days until even a prosecutor reviews the report and then makes the decision if there's even substantial charges. Which, if you think about that, that's crazy to be in custody, 2 to 5 days, depending on when you're booked in, simply on a suspicion of law enforcement. And it's not to say that some people haven't committed a crime, that's why we have the justice system, but it's crazy that you're completely taken away from something and really at the discretion of law enforcement to set that bail and the charges they book you in.
Well, you make such a good point right there too, though, because especially if I always say that the biggest, the kryptonite to the presumption of innocence is probable cause. Because, if an officer has probable cause, then that negates your presumption of innocence because they're allowed to arrest you based off of that probable cause, which is a very low legal standard. And then you're right, a prosecutor or prosecutorial agencies have 3 days in some places. Obviously, that's a very jurisdictional timeline, but have at least 24 hours, I would say, to consider whether or not there are merits to file a charge. And if they're not, well, you just lost 24 hours of your time unless you're able to, within some type of hours, get access to hundreds, potentially thousands of dollars to post bail, because until you're actually charged, there is no judge to consider whether or not to release you either on your own recognizance or other subtype of release. And so I always think that, to me, the craziest part of incarceration, quite frankly, is how easily someone can actually find themselves to be in that position, right? Because so many people sometimes think that it's so astronomically hard to find themselves to be incarcerated. And we see it often that, that's frankly not true, right?
Exactly. No, definitely. And it's just crazy too, when you think about it, that you're on that probable cause standard when there's nothing even substantiated on a higher standard based on law enforcement discretion, that you're taking someone and completely ripping them away from their life. It's just something else. And I was thinking about, as far as when people are incarcerated, they're taken away from their daily lives. And a lot of times these are people who also might have medical issues as well. And we see the process of getting them their medical needs, or if they have issues, try to get seen by medical staff is just a lot harder process, because they don't have that. So imagine not having access to medicine or your daily medication. And then it's no wonder why, the mental health or just medical illnesses are exacerbated while being incarcerated, even 2 to 3 days.
And everything matters. And some will say, yeah, well, don't do the crime if you can't do the time. But that goes back to the almost first point we'll make is that, well, first and foremost, the majority of people and I want to focus on county jail, because that's really where any potential alternative to custody can exist. Obviously, if someone commits a serious or violent type of crime and they're sentenced to a state prison, there becomes drastically less alternatives, potentially none at all whatsoever. And so we're talking about the type of individuals who are more or less looking at only a year maximum worth of custody exposure. And so there really needs to be a conversation to highlight the type of financial cost it takes to house an individual and whether or not that consideration is worth it, especially when, I'll try to find it and put it in the show notes. I just recently saw annual report that said, I think over 50% of individuals across the country that are currently being housed in a county jail are there pre-trial. They have not been convicted on the pending charges that they are currently facing, yet they are being housed and treated and restricted in the same type of ways and facilities as those that are there who have been sentenced, who have not been found suitable for an alternative. And if anything, I don't think you can't say to those individuals, don't do the crime if you don't want to do the time, because at that point in time, they haven't been convicted of that. And so I do think that when more people become aware of alternatives, when they realize that it will have a financial benefit to them as an individual taxpayer and as a community, that will really consider them and get them more implemented. And so I want to start getting into what an alternative to custody is. Grant, can you just give us a brief introduction? Obviously, we'll get into the various types that exist, but what is the kind of just the theory and benefits?
Yeah, so we can even look either, pre-trial or pre-plea or sentencing or even at the sentencing scheme. But these alternatives to custody is basically a different way for an individual to, one, prior to being any type of sentence, obviously be in a different situation than just being in jail, especially under the presumption of innocence. But even if they pled guilty at sentencing, it's an alternative to just being incarcerated. And really, these alternatives are, I think, should be, and I think I think the root of it is as a focus to reduce the recidivism, especially, and also be more beneficial, especially for people who might be first-time offenders or lower-level offenders.
And I want to pause you right there because I think that you really hit a key moment, and I didn't want to forget it. And that was that an alternative to custody really allows for an individual to potentially address the root cause of the criminal conduct, because as we have gotten to see because of our intimate relationship within the criminal justice system and our specific type of clientele, a lot of them fit within that minority protected class mold. We see that there is a root cause. It is not this just objective criminal motive, and that's consistent with the type of sentencing that they're facing, right? Again, we're not in the realm of a series of violent offense, and so I think that really needed to be focused on, and I want you to continue, but I just thought that was such an important part that shouldn't have been overlooked.
Definitely, and I think with that, it's coupled with is basically integrating them back into society. Like we were talking about earlier, incarceration is quite different. You're taking someone out of their daily life and routine. And, most of these individuals, people can say, oh, it's not that much time. It's not like it's prison and we're looking at a large number, but you're still taking someone away from everything, their daily life and daily routine, and completely throwing them in a completely different environment. And that's unsettling for anyone, And so I think these alternatives are helpful to make sure that an individual is getting some consequences of its sentencing, but also being able to integrate back into society. Hopefully it is at the root of the cause to address those matters, to reduce the recidivism, to give them the tools to not, reoffend, but also just to kind of show them, that there's ways to productively engage in society. And those are what those alternatives are there for. And especially for the lower people who are low risk offenders or first time offenders, or obviously not as serious crimes. And so I think that's what those alternatives to custodies are at the heart of it created for, and hopefully they address.
Well, what would you say to the critics who say that, alternatives to custody don't serve the same purpose or send the same message as actual custody, that, that's even more of a slap on the wrist than potentially, if they looked at a maximum sentence of prison and a county jail sentence as, potentially a less imposed punishment, or even if they consider that a slap on the wrist? What would you say to the critics who think that, just alternatives custody would serve no purpose because it would allow them to still have access to what they did?
Yeah, I mean, I think there definitely is a lot of critics to it. And I think it's really what you have to do as like focus of what is the criminal justice system here for, right? If it's simply to incarcerate individuals, then by all means, get rid of alternatives to custodies that we're going to discuss. But if your hope is that you do not want people to reoffend, if you hope that they're going to get the proper treatment, if your hope is that we can realistically reduce crime and help our society, then that's what these alternatives are there for. So someone who just wants to throw the book and just lock the key, throw away the key and just incarcerate these individuals, they're forgetting what you do to an individual by incarcerating them, like the root of what the environment that you're placing someone in. And they're not getting the resources once they have done their time. Once they get out, ultimately everyone's going to get out absent of, very high crimes. You're going to want them to be able to reintegrate into society. We don't want to just throw people away. And if you just want incarceration, then you're not trying to fix or help with a solution at all. And I think that's what the mindset you have to look at, or for the critics, you got to look at and say, well, if your hope is to protect society, then is your solution actually going to help in the long run? So it's kind of like short-term versus long-term goals. Sure, short time, you get this person out, you put them in jail for whatever X amount of time, but you're not giving them the tools or the resources once they get out to get better in society or not reoffend. So it's very short-sighted.
Right. Like, are you and I agree, because I'm like, are you thinking like, okay, let's just momentarily think, if this person was in a bad position, right, that led to their crime. Often we see poor people commit thefts, for example, or homeless people, act out of anger because they're upset that they're homeless. And it's like, if they're in a bad position and then they're sentenced to jail time, which comes with all of its restrictions and limitations, which is going to displace them even further, how can there then be an expectation that that person is going to be in a better position to then not have to result to the same situation? And they have a tough time answering that, because I think that doesn't flow logically. Obviously, that formula isn't a winning formula. And so there needs, and I think obviously the data will support it, legislators agree because they've implemented it, and that you can find a happy medium where an individual is to an extent confined, right? We can also talk about incarceration is a form of confinement, right? You can be confined without being incarcerated. You can be restricted to certain places and areas and have other limitations imposed on you with supervision, but still be able to access it. And so the question is, what is the goal, Grant? And I think that highlights a very important thing. And I think if you're a taxpayer, one and foremost, you should think about your own pocket, which I think a lot of the country does. And secondly, it's right. If you just continue to think short term, well, you're not looking out for that individual or yourself, because again, it costs more money to actually traditionally incarcerate someone than it will be to get into these alternatives. So I think it's a good time to go ahead and start introducing some of the alternatives to custody that allow for people to serve out their times, but be in a great position to have better access to rehabilitation. And I think the first and foremost one that I'd like you to introduce to the members of the jury is the notion of house arrest, and how that could successfully allow an individual to serve out a jail sentence, but also be in positions to come out in actually a better position than they were going in to that situation.
Yeah, so house arrest or house detention is a great alternative to custody. Typically, an individual is able to continue to reside in their residence. They're only able to go out for very limited circumstances. Traditionally, you're thinking of going to work, or if you're just going to school, or your medical appointments. And then anything outside of kind of those frameworks, I think, have to be authorized by the program. But it's a great alternative to custody, especially for people who, I think, mainly for work. You know, when we incarcerate people, we forget that these are actual people. A lot of times, I think in general, it kind of goes back, not to look back, but what we view people as. When we think that they've offended, we kind of forget that they're human, that we forget that they have families or jobs, and they do contribute to some extent. And so it's a great way to allow someone to continue with their job and to support their family and still be present. We've obviously see the issues of people who are incarcerated on the next generation, and we don't want to have that cycle continue. We also don't want someone to lose their job, because then we're just placing them in a worse situation than when they were before they had resolved their case. And so home detention is great. And it's not, once again, like you were talking about, there's ways to confine someone but not have to be incarcerated in jail. This person, for lack of better words, is confined in their home, absent of those very few exceptions. And then normally those individuals obviously are monitored and tracked, usually by like a GPS device. And so that's a way that we can ensure that they're, remaining where they're supposed to be. And then obviously, we won't go too far, but it's obviously takes away a lot of the psychological issues of being incarcerated. You still get the socialization. You're still getting, you're not getting disrupted by being placed in a completely different environment. And so I think just the psychological advantages of home detention are great too.
That's a huge component and piece to it. I think you're absolutely right. Especially when you go back and you're looking under the microscope of those who are in actually serving time in the county jails, and we see that again, most of them are pre-trial, and then we need to ask ourselves, should there be some type of distinguishment between those who are ordered confined pre-trial and those who are ordered to be confined post-conviction or plea deal? And in my opinion, is absolutely yes. And I think that does then take that into consideration. It doesn't allow them to, there is a degree of separation of the confinement, which I think under the law accounts for those convicted and those don't. What's your position or your argument against those who say, well, I would love to just be on house arrest. I could just, smoke weed and do drugs and play video games and drink alcohol. Like, I who cares if I'm bound to my house? How does that make me better?
No, I mean, definitely. And I think a lot of people forget, like, if there's a substance abuse component, well, one, most of these people are post plea, but even then, like, there a lot of times if there is substance or alcohol, that's being monitored too. It's pretty easy to monitor that with the ankle bracelet. But as far as like, are they just at home or versus that? I mean, you got to compare and contrast the situation they're going to be incarcerated, right? Incarceration, there's nothing productive that they're doing in the same thing. In fact, I think once again, looking at the psychological and medical disadvantages of being incarcerated versus being housed in your home, that's way better for an individual in the long run about whether or not they are going to reoffend or not, versus if you just incarcerate them, once again, they're not gaining anything from it versus, and just the negatives once again is those negative impact to the medical or mental health of the individual. At least if we home detention, even if they're not going out, at least they're being placed in an environment that's not going to impact them as negatively as it was going to be incarcerated in a jail setting. But again, I think too, it's kind of a generalization, right? Most of the people who are wanting home detention are people who, are actually working or they have kids. Once again, I think it comes to this generalization or lack of understanding of who actually people are who enter the system. It's really could just be your neighbor or your friend. It's not all the time these people who, are the worst of the worst, and once again, it's funny. It's always the common thing of everyone likes to look at the 1 or 2% who mess it up, but there's still 98, 99% of the people who are actually gaining it. And so it's just funny that I think a lot of critics on the opposite side like to take that 1%, 2%, and then just poison the rest. And it's like, that's not how it works. Statistically, that's not how it works. Logically, that's not how it works.
And I think that's what has led to a big factor in what has led to, as we've seen, the rise in mass incarceration. And I've always said and like to say, if you continue to do things the same, that's the definition. Without an expected different outcome, that's insanity. And so we've seen how over the last number of decades, we've just resulted in over-criminalization of crimes, of mental health, of addiction, and that has resulted in incarceration. But we see in the data that the numbers, it's not resolving those issues. It's not getting to the crux. It's not getting to the core. And so I think it's time that we see that these are having positive institutions. And also, let's be fair, people in custody are getting drugs, alcohol, playing video games on TV, having TikTok. So like, are we really seeing a discrepancy or disparity there? No, but is it costing drastically more money? Absolutely, yes. So I think that you're right. With that confinement, you're ankle monitored, you're tracked. And honestly, I think a secret component of it, oftentimes too, is then you have a deeper sense of family, like commitment and contribution, right? Because in order to be ordered to have house arrest, you have to have all of the people within the resident consent to it, which means basically they're on the same line as you. They're aware of the situation, and so there's more accountability, and that can, although suck at times in a sense of like being overbearing, but I think for a lot of these individuals, it then gives them an opportunity where they actually had no family involvement or no participation to have them care actually a little bit more, because now they see themselves in a very serious situation and are determined for it not to get worse and for it not to happen again.
And yeah, it's kind of like putting the incarceration into the home too. Like that's kind of, to me, would be almost like somewhat of like an embarrassment, or makes it a little bit more real of that overlap. Versus if you're just incarcerated, I mean, definitely you're separated from your family and stuff, but you're able to keep that very much separate, absent of like visits. But like home detention, like that's, like you said, they're consenting. You're bringing in the criminal justice system into your home, and I think that's something, at least like if for my family, that would be wow. Like it's kind of like I would never want to have my partner or someone else have to consent because of what I did.
100%. That's an excellent point. House arrest, I think, is a great alternative. It accomplishes the very similar aspects and the accountability and attacks recidivism. So if someone, for example, maybe they don't quite qualify. Oh, that's what I was going to say. You made an excellent. I would be super interested to see the data as to first-time offenders, because I think you're right. So many people have this notion that all of the people who are currently involved in the criminal justice system have like criminal records and criminal past, and are like completely actually oblivious to the fact that a huge chunk, and I don't have the data, and I'd be super interested to see it, are first-time offenders. second-time offenders that found themselves in sticky situations that can be quickly addressed. And I thought that was really key. And I think that oftentimes, quite frankly, goes unnoticed by a lot of societies and quite frankly, lawmakers when thinking of criminal justice. So I thought that could have a huge impact when people are trying to advocate, if they don't have that option, to then have home arrest become more of a possibility in their community. So let's get into a second alternative to custody, and that's when someone doesn't necessarily qualify for what, in my opinion, what would be the ultimate benefit or the ultimate alternative to custody of house arrest. What is something that's considered work furlough?
Yeah, so work furlough is another great alternative to custody. Normally, these individuals they will stay at a kind of like in a dorm setting. So once again, it's a little bit of an upgrade from incarceration, but you are still being housed in more of a dorm type of setting. You have to reside there and stay there. So it's not your own home. And the only way that you're able to leave, once again, is more of like, or specifically you're for work or for, school as well. And really those are the very limited circumstances that you're able to leave. You obviously, once you go to work, so let's say it's 8 to 5, you got to come back right away, or you would be in violation. And obviously then you could have that privilege revoked. So it's very limited on what you're able to go. You are obviously separated from your family if you have one, or it's a great alternative too for people who maybe their situation as far as having a house or a home is a little bit more in flux than other individuals. And obviously we all know the price of housing is high. But also, like, we forget too, when we look at pretrial, like we were talking about earlier, is a lot of people, they could be incarcerated for, even like a week. And if they miss their rent, they're out, you know what I mean? So a lot of these people, sometimes even before their sentence, they lose their home in that sense. And obviously that was why they couldn't maybe qualify for home detention, but they still potentially could have their job or they're going to school. So work furlough is a great program as well. And then it also, it is able to provide them, I think, once again, able to have that income source, that financial income source, which is so detrimental. Everything our society is derived from having finances and money. And so it allows someone to continue to get that. So we won't even go into the fines and costs if when you get a charge.
And I think it's an important thing, again, because it accomplishes this custodial aspect, but it allows for cut costs. When an individual is serving time on work furlough, they don't have to be monitored. They're not being provided all of the same type of housing and requirements and meals that someone who is serving traditional incarceration times are. So it allows for a aspect of a financial save there, but still making sure that they are accountable each and every day, reporting to and from the custodial facility, but now allowing them to continue their livelihood, because absolutely, I would argue one of the biggest causes for recidivism is because, going back to the earlier point, when people get out after serving a time, they're often in positions less fortunate, more burdensome than they were prior to the time that they went into their incarceration, and not having any stream of income, or having one and having it taken away because you served time, is going to be even more detrimental. So to allow someone to maintain and progressively their rehabilitation steps to keeping their job through a system like work furlough, or even continuing their education, is again such a huge benefit. And I think you made an excellent point with how oftentimes, especially maybe on that second time offender, that now they're looking at a situation because based on the first time they were unhoused, they lost their home, they lost their job, and so now they have to find themselves they don't qualify for certain alternatives, and their position is getting worse and worse. Whereas if maybe they had been given an opportunity as that alternative on the first offense, they're not in that same position afterwards that then caused for the recidivism. So you're bringing up very excellent points and arguments, and I hope a lot of people are able to see the effectiveness that these alternative to custodies truly have, and hopefully continue to argue for them. If you're a lawyer in court or if you're an advocate, get them to your legislators, because one of the biggest accomplishments that I think the alternative to custodies do, again, especially as far as create a distinction between those who are pretrial and those who have been sentenced, is it really creates a gap and an elimination of what I think a lot of people refer to as crime U. You'll have people who will be serving time or being accused of crimes such as stealing a car, whether they're sentenced to stealing a car or they're awaiting trial for stealing another car. Their cellmate in a county jail could be accused of murder, could be sentenced to off on some type of gnarly drug importation case. And it just then, if you confine them to it, that goes to your point. While you're incarcerated, what are you going to do, right? You're very limited. You're going to spend your time talking to those you're surrounded by. And that's why oftentimes people come out with more type of criminality on their mind than anything else, because that's all they've been exposed to the time of their incarceration.
Yeah, and I think like you made the point too, is like these programs are helpful because we're not putting them in a place worse at when they started, right? That's not what we should be doing in any form of custody or sentence or consequences for an action. We think about logically with a consequence. We don't want to put someone further back than what they were at, because then how can we really expect them to integrate back into society if we're putting them in a worse position than when they offended? If logically, once again, most of these individuals offend, maybe mental health or substance abuse, lack of financial resources. There's a lot of things that drive people to commit crimes. Why are we going to place them in a situation worse than what they initially do? Like logically, that makes complete no sense. And then you can't get mad at them, ultimately, if, in some sort of way, if they do reoffend, because you placed them in a situation way worse than when they started. So, I think the goal of consequences in the criminal justice system should not place someone in a worse position. And, there's obviously has to be consequences for actions that have a criminality to it. But, we also have to look at, like, again, short-term versus long-term. What is the long-term goal of this individual?
One of the things that just came to my head while you were talking was, I don't know if you've ever seen the show, but there's a show, I forget what channel it's on, but it's called 60 Days In, where it has people go inside county jails for low-level offenses, and it highlights exactly what me and Grant are talking about. Their specific job, for the purpose of this show, is to see all of the potential contraband and issues that exist within county jails. And you should see the type of things that people are exposed to, despite the type of limitations and restrictions that they're facing with. And you have to ask yourself, is every single person who commits all of the type of crimes out there, is it equivalent of that type of setting, of that type of treatment, and of that type of atmosphere? And no, it's not. So I just, to quite frankly tell you, I disagree. If you do, I'd love to hear. If you oppose me, feel free to email me, and let's have a chat, because I just don't see how you could argue that just because all crimes are equal and deserve just a fundamental bottomness of life and treatment of respect. I strongly disagree if you have that position. And that's why I'm a big advocate for these alternatives to custody, because I think they take a deeper level of measurement and accountability and case-by-case analysis that should be more implemented often. So we got two more alternatives, Grant, that I want to get through. This next one is pretty similar to work furlough, but it really allows for individuals who actually don't have a job at the time of their incarceration to potentially be put in a position where during whatever time they have been sentenced to or are facing can maybe develop the skills or even a job. And that's something referred to as residential reentry. Can you give the members of the jury an insight as to what that type of sentence looks like?
Yes, this is a great sentence, like you mentioned, for people who, either didn't have a job coming in or lost their job because of their incarceration. Typically, they're still housed in the same type of program dorm setting as like the work furlough. But what's great for this program is that they are able to have kind of like a case manager for their situation, trying to get them basically out into the workforce so they can work on basically like resume and job searching, which are great skills, are hard skills actually to gain. Not everyone gets those advantages depending on their background. And so being able to learn those skills and then being able to then look for a job and gain employment is great for them, because once again, we're being able to allow them to have a way to financially have an income, which a lot of times is what drives people to commit crimes, is a lack of financial resources, and then ultimately have the necessary job skills as well. And so it places them in a lot better setting. And it's great too. They're still being housed and monitored. Obviously, all the overarching issues regarding alternatives. So it's a great alternative to that.
And again, it really goes to the crux of, and what I think our opinion is that it eliminates a lot of the unnecessary exposure to restrictions and additional limitations that don't go towards rehabilitation. And so that is specifically what that is. And I think it's super important. Actually, this is a great moment to highlight, and we kind of potentially should have done it on the onset, but that first and foremost, as we've definitely indicated throughout the show, is not everybody qualifies for these alternatives to custodies. There's a very certain type of criteria and formality that has to go through and be assessed. Often that's done by a probation report or definitely their feedback. But then each and every one of these alternatives to custody, because they're entwined within the custodial aspects, they're generally run by probation or the sheriffs, because that's how closely connected to confinement these programs are. So there's always a very systemic assessment that is being done to ensure that these people are those that are in good positions to benefit from these alternatives. Can you give us a little bit of insight as to what the type of screening and assessment is for those three previously addressed alternatives: the work furlough, the house arrest, and the residential reentry?
Yeah. So first and foremost, they obviously have to be the qualifying offense. It has to be something that's going to allow them to be in local jail. So we're not looking at a prison offense. They obviously can't have any outstanding cases that haven't been resolved. So either within like San Diego or outside the jurisdiction as well, or any pending cases. For the home detention, the house has to meet the requirements of the residents. And then biggest thing is qualifying offenses. So, these aren't people who are what we think as very large, serious offenses like, sex offenses, homicide cases, anything that involves like gang related. So kind of the big offenses, what some viewers might know as like strike offenses are pretty much most likely disqualifying as far as the current charge. And then also they'll look into the background of the individual too, as far as their history too. And so if there's those types of offenses as well, then that can disqualify someone. And ultimately it's really the discretion of the agency. So and the current offense. So if there is something that is probation or the other agencies, they don't look at like when they review the applicant, then it's up to their discretion. It's not anything that a judge can guarantee. It's not anything that we can guarantee or the prosecutor. It's really up to them. And so and ultimately, something that's also should be noted is there's no early release in any of this either. Whatever X amount of time that you're sentenced and allowed to do these alternatives, you do that time. So if it's X amount of time in home detention, you don't get early release or anything like that. And so those qualifications are required and very much looked at. So you definitely is an application process, like you told, an evaluated process. And there's some people who don't qualify.
I think the biggest thing is there's generally always an interview component with the individual, and they're really looking at the motivating factors and what the mindset is, because you have to do commitment. And if you think for 1 second that if you're given this type of advantage and you take advantage of it and you don't do what you're supposed to and you go out and you commit more crimes, or you don't follow through with the restrictions and limitations placed on you, that you're still subject to repercussions. Or in the worst case scenario, obviously, since you didn't learn a lesson, or since you didn't successfully engage in rehabilitation and you reoffend, you're absolutely unlikely to be given a second opportunity to these alternatives to custody. And so there are things that have been considered to prevent those who take advantage, or those who would think of taking advantage of this, quite frank, luxury of an alternative to custody. And so the last alternative to custody that I think is worth addressing also requires a certain type of assessment, qualifications, and commitment, but it really addresses a specific type of criminality. And that's an individual, in my opinion, that suffers from either substance abuse or a mental health illness. And the alternative to custody is for them to spend a time in a residential treatment facility that can address their individual underlying issue, or both. Grant, can you give us some insight into how residential treatment facilities are a great alternative to custody?
Yeah, so these are the individuals you might look at who, their offense is mainly driven by substance abuse. So, they could have been highly under the influence at the time of their offense. They might be struggling to integrate back in society because of a substance abuse, or on the alternative side, but on the other framework too, could be just someone who suffers from mental health. And just unfortunately, both of these, and obviously there's a huge overlap with our people who have both a substance abuse and mental health issue. So these are individuals who I think are very much at risk for reoffending, because they are in the system because they were not getting the proper treatment at the time of their offense. If it's substance abuse, they weren't getting that treatment. If it's mental health, they weren't either engaging in counseling or maintaining their medication. And then you couple this, usually all these individuals, you couple with the biggest layer is financial. So most of the time they're not employed, they don't have housing. So these are probably the most at-risk individuals who are likely. Incarceration is just not going to help, because once again, we're putting them further back just by incarcerating them. So an individual who might have a substance abuse, we could, once again, they get screened by a substance abuse assessor to determine if they are quite serious actually about their substance abuse issue. So the assessor will obviously look at the intent of the applicant, and then determine if there's an appropriate program for them. A residential treatment is not a locked facility, but it is an inpatient type program. So they are housed there. They get the program. There's obviously curfew. If they have a job, they can obviously work with a coordinator as well. And, those programs roughly can last minimum to 6 months up to a year. And the goal is that they're going to be able to gain the necessary skills to address what in my opinion, at least is unfortunately a disease that they will unfortunately suffer for the rest of their life. And then on the other scheme of mental health, it's kind of funny. There's actually not a lot of residential mental health programs in our society, which is quite crazy in this aspect. It's usually a lot of what is traditionally called outpatient, which is that there's no housing. An individual is not required to stay there. It's simply like if you think about like a local pharmacy or a CVS. So the person goes, gets the services, and they leave. It's not that they can't get resources. There's nothing wrong with outpatient type programming. But I think even mental health individuals, people who suffer from mental health are even more at risk than even substance abuse people. And like I said, it just can get exacerbated if someone suffers from both. But there are a few residential programs for people who suffer from mental health. It requires a pretty high level of diagnosis and mental health illness. But once again, the goal is that these individuals will get the counseling to, once again, really, and this I don't think there really is a debate, is a disease for something that someone suffers. And what's crazy for this one is this is all pure for someone who suffers from mental health. It's purely biological. If you think about it, this is not something that an individual, gained by any means for their environment necessarily. Most of it is biologically driven. Some of it could be due to their, the parent while they were in the womb. So it could be a history, it could be genetics. And so these are very unfortunate individuals who, what they unfortunately have to deal with for the rest of their life is quite a huge uphill battle. But releasing someone to these types of programmings are great because, once again, we're addressing the root of the issue. And obviously these provide what we typically call more of like wraparound services. So they're going to help with housing. They're going to provide with employment. If they have issues with transportation, they're going to help that with that as well. And they're getting counseling as well, which is how to address and manage their condition. And so these are great alternatives, once again, to get to the root of the issue of why an individual is offended, and hopefully then can be able to integrate back in society despite, if their substance abuse or mental health disorder.
Again, you've said it again. We'll say it again. Getting at the root is the best solution to preventing long-term criminal justice issues, recidivism rates, you name it. If you're able to get to the root of the issue, you're better to see the odds of being in a better situation, in our opinion, is just better. And I think it's fair to say that it is very limited in the number of individuals who have gone on to residential treatment facilities, successfully graduate from their program. I think it's fair to say that I know personally in my experience, I can't think of seeing one back or within a close proximity to that. They usually are able to get stabilized. And as long as they stay on top of that regimen, they can go periods, or if not the rest of their life, with never returning back to criminality. And so, Grant, I really want to thank you for bringing the matter of alternatives to custody to the box. It's something that should be highlighted. Again, I think some of the best solutions and benefits that we could see across the country and across the system is that we would have more money to have an excess to reform the system, because we wouldn't be spending as much per person annually. It costs roughly $80,000 a year to incarcerate someone, where you could put them on an alternative to custody for the same period of time for roughly $10,000 a year. And with that excess money, you could continue to invest in underfunded communities so that they don't find themselves in situations to begin with that then they have to therefore feel that they have to result to criminality. I think you would see an overall better impact on recidivism rates and having the ability to get access to treatment and counseling. And again, you would have a huge effect on the difference between those pre-trial and those convicted and those of small time offenses versus more serious. And so it's been a great episode. The question we always end the show with is, as an advocate, whether that be in the courtroom or outside of it, what is the significance of taking a matter that you deeply care about to the box and to getting it the attention it deserves?
I think there's obviously a lot of reasons that taking the matter to the box, but I think at the heart of it is that we have such an amazing system in America. Like, it's mind-baffling when you think about it. Like, our framers of our Constitution and our founding fathers created this system. Like, I was just refreshed by it when I went to DC and learned some more additional information. but it's such an amazing system that we have this presumption of innocence, which, is a little bit obviously tweaked by media and society. But I think the importance, once again, is to really be able to present someone and really say this person is innocent unless it's proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And it's obviously, if we really believe in that aspect, it's a great thing to say that we really believe in someone, that they have not committed this crime absent of a really high burden. Because, like we were saying, incarceration is a serious thing. It's a serious consequence that we can impose on someone, even with these alternatives. And so I think taking to the box is really protecting the liberties of someone, because it's a lot to take away the liberties of someone when you incarcerate someone. And so I think that's the beauty and the root of it. And I think that's really what the framers were looking at, of not placing someone in incarceration without this high standard and high burden. And obviously too, is still viewing this person as a person. You know what I mean? Like, I think that's really torn away from a lot of people on the critics or the opposite sides. They don't view this person as this individual as a person. And it really is, I think, taking it to the box is really being able to provide that background and that framework, and making this individual a lot more full than just the title of defendant or criminal, which we like to really much just slap easily onto someone simply because they're in court. And so I think that's just the beauty of taking it to the box, is that you're able to, really get to stand up and really, defend someone. But I think it's also living the beauty of our system and what our founding fathers wanted, which is, it's revolutionary. And if you think about it, it's so impactful, because we look at other systems and they're mirroring us or copying us. And it's because it's such a beautiful system when it works, obviously.
Amen, my brother. Amen. Well, Grant, thank you so much for coming on the show. We're very appreciative of it. And, we look forward to future conversations and hopefully seeing more implementations of alternatives to custody imposed. Thanks so much. Well, members of the jury, that's our show, and I rest my case. Be sure to come back next episode as we take another matter to the box. If you're a fan of the show, go ahead and subscribe. You can also find us on social media at Members of the Jury. If you want to be a guest or have any feedback, be sure to email us at lhursty@membersofthejurypod.com. The information in this podcast is provided as general reference work as a public service. The audience is advised to check for changes to current laws and to consult with a qualified attorney on any legal issue. The use of this material does not create an attorney-client privilege in any fashion with the podcast, the host, or the guest. This information is for educational purposes only, and no one affiliated with the podcast may be held liable for any decision made based on this information.